Hello, everyone, and thanks for tuning in to another episode of Christ in the Classroom presented by Sophia Institute for Teachers. I'm your host, Jose Gonzalez. Tonight's episode is entitled Addressing Misconceptions About Freedom. And joining me here very shortly will be Father Thomas Dailey from St. Charles Borromeo Seminary in Philadelphia. And look forward to introducing him and having him join us in just a moment. So tonight's topic, we are going to reflect on the concept of freedom. Being free is something I think all of us desire greatly. It's probably, especially in today's culture and today's climate, it seems to be the greatest virtue and the greatest value that human beings aspire to and desire, and we see lots of problems based on an incorrect understanding of what freedom truly means. Yet it is something that within us we naturally desire it. We desire the ability to make choices. We desire the ability to do as we please. It's just ingrained within our being. And so if we can make choices in a way that helps us better understand our freedom, it will lead to greater happiness. It will lead to greater joy. I'm reminded of, and we see in kids especially, right? In my experience as a classroom teacher, what was a kid's greatest complaints oftentimes about the Catholic belief system or the church was they felt like, oh, there's all these rules and I can't just do what I want, right? This desire that was in them oftentimes because they didn't understand that those things were there for a reason. I often laugh. One of my funny moments as a parent was one day my oldest looks at us and says, I can't wait till I'm older because then I can do whatever I want. Like, for example, I would put my kids to bed and then I would take their Halloween candy and I would sit and watch movies and eat all their candy because I could do whatever I want. And it just made us chuckle, the beautiful innocence of a child. But that desire for freedom, she interpreted as I can do what I want, which so many of us misinterpret it as such. So tonight we will reflect on this. What does freedom truly mean? What are the misconceptions out there, and how do we address those misconceptions? And joining me to discuss this is Father Thomas Dailey. Father, how are you this evening?
I'm good, Jose. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us tonight. Why don't you just take a moment to introduce yourselves to those listening or tuning in live here?
Well, sure. Hello, everyone. I'm Father Tom Dailey. I hold the John Cardinal Foley Chair of Communications at St. Charles Seminary in Philadelphia, one of the older seminaries in the country. And prior to this, I had taught for almost 30 years at DeSales University in Allentown, Pennsylvania. So I'm a Pennsylvania boy.
Well, great. Wonderful. Thanks to have you with us. Father Dailey is actually one of the first speakers that we ever partnered with when we first started doing our in-person workshops. And so it's a great joy that we continue to interface with him and work with him on occasion. And I'm grateful to have him on this evening. So let's begin with diving into our topic. Father, what would you say are the biggest misconceptions of freedom that exist out there?
I was trying to think of this when you gave me the topic to speak about, and I don't know if they're the biggest misconceptions, but I did come up with what I think are four popular ones. The first is the idea that freedom means having no constraints. Nothing holds me back from what I want to choose. A second misconception, and the biggest one, I believe, is the notion that freedom is about self-determination, in the sense that I determine myself what to do, how to think, how to act, how to speak. It's my freedom. A third way of misconceiving freedom is to suggest that freedom is free, which is a another way of saying the first one, but also the notion that there is no cost to freedom, that it is something absolute in and of itself, which leads to the fourth misconception, and that's the idea that freedom is our ultimate value, freedom is our ultimate good. It's something that we champion at the highest level because it is a value in itself. I think they're the four. They're the four I could come up with.
Well, when I hear you explain those, they for sure bring back to many arguments I had with students in the classroom, as far as that's exactly how many of them perceived freedom, how many of them uh, valued valued freedom and felt it was something that they were entitled to, in a sense. How would you begin to, address these misconceptions with folks?
Well, I think the primary thing, without a doubt, one that colors all of these misconceptions, is the idea of what it means to be a person. In other words, most of our differences in many arenas, but especially when it comes to human freedom, most of these have an anthropological basis. That is to say, we have differing ideas of what it means to be a person. Um, Oftentimes, we're not even conscious that that's where it's coming from. But as I hope to show tonight, there are different ideas of what it means to be human. And those ideas lead to the misconceptions about freedom. Based on that anthropology and our understanding of who we are as individual persons, we can then talk a little bit about freedom in a political sphere or a social political sphere, which takes the anthropological and broadens it into society. And then finally, or ultimately, freedom is a religious question, not so much in terms of the political question of religious freedom, but in the sense of freedom in terms of me as a person in relation to God. I think those three areas will address these four misconceptions.
Great. So let's begin by, can you expound on the anthropological then? What is the anthropology of freedom, essentially?
Sure. And here's where we're going to break it down even further. We can speak about the anthropology of freedom in terms of understanding freedom as a matter of ability, my ability to say or think or do something, the possibility that I have to say or think or do something, and the responsibility I have to say or think or do something. So, first, in terms of ability, freedom at its, if you want to call it, its lowest level, its natural level, means not being constrained. All right, it is that first misconception. There's a truth to it. It's the notion that if there is nothing holding something back, then that something can do what it's meant to do. Think of a balloon flying. If there's nothing getting in the way of the balloons, nothing that the balloon is tied to, it can float away. So there's no physical constraint, and so something in nature is free to do what it's supposed to do. All right, that's the sort of lowest level. Let's raise it up a notch, though, and speak in terms of psychological constraint. Now we're getting into the world not simply of natural happenings, but the living world, the animal world, for instance. Every animal, including we human animals, have a sense of or operate on the level of instinct, right? I have an instinct to get angry. I have an instinct to be kind. We all tend in a certain direction. That's just part of our natural makeup. We all have appetites. I get hungry right about this hour, in fact, right around this time. And so we think that we are free to follow these instincts and appetites. So we are free to eat something when I'm hungry. I'm free to sing something when I'm happy. Those basic kind of lower level realities about us. Now, they can be constrained psychologically by what we'll call pressure. And we tend to apply pressure in a couple of different ways, right? So we can typically, those two ways are by threatening or rewarding, right? So we hold out the possibility that a choice I'm going to make is going to cause pain. Right? That threat constrains my making such a choice. Or the flip side, if I make that choice, I'm going to get rewarded. So that leads me to make the choice. So in a sense, while constraint might be too strong a term, those psychological pressures are what we impose upon people in many ways. This is basically behavioral psychology. Right? This is the model that if I hold out rewards or threats, I can induce certain choices and certain behaviors. It certainly works in the animal world. I give a dog a bone and it's rewarded and for choosing to do what I wanted it to do, and vice versa. I can inflict pain. You see that we do this even with children. Children who have not yet reached the age of reason, they are little animals in a good sense. I'm not denouncing little children at all, but think about how we raise and teach children in a very young age. It's the reward and punishment kind of system, and so this notion of freedom is actually a limited freedom based on the psychological pressures that we apply. And so to speak of freedom as our ability to do something is to consider it in terms of the absence of all these constraints. This is what typically we refer to as a freedom from. Okay? So beyond behavioral psychology, the notion is that we are free from any kind of constraint, physical or psychological. The question, though, is whether that is sufficient for human beings. Because even in a grown-up child, for example, right, who we're not pressuring into a decision, is that enough? Is that enough for the older child or young adult to make a decision, to make a free choice that's going to be good for him? That becomes the question. And so the, in a sense, corrected way of speaking about freedom as human ability is to look at its distinctive human contours, which the Second Vatican Council put in these words: man's dignity, right, what separates us from the animals and from the rest of nature. Man's dignity demands that he act according to a knowing and free choice, a choice that is personally motivated and prompted from within. All right, so there's the absence of physical or psychological constraint. So it's a choice that is prompted from within, not under blind internal impulse. It's not our animal nature making us do something, nor by mere external pressure. It's not someone else influencing my choice. Man achieves such dignity, the council said, when emancipating himself from all captivity to passion. I love that line. Emancipating himself, freeing himself from being tied to his passions, his natural human inclinations and instincts and appetites. Freed from that, he can pursue his goal in a spontaneous choice of what is good. And he procures for himself, through effective and skillful action, apt or appropriate helps to that end.
So, Father, just a quick question: could we say then that if a human being, a true understanding of the freedom or the free will that is distinctively human, even when there are like external quote unquote constraints,
Mhm.
You can never, like, the free will can never truly be completely suppressed or or constrained fully, correct? Like, if
Well, yes, you could say that in the sense that I am always free in terms of how I look at or respond to being constrained.
right,
Um, I have that freedom of thought, if you will. But in the more global sense of the freedom that is indicative of and that contributes to being human, then even freedom from such pressures is critical. So, for example, just to give you, the old-fashioned example we used to use in marriage cases, if you're coming before the altar and her father is holding a shotgun, the man is not free
right,
to marry. He can say the words, he
yeah,
can choose to stay in the church, but theoretically, or within, he's not free.
yeah, got it.
So this is much more a notion of freedom for our good as human beings, our dignity as human beings, than a freedom from. So that misconception that says freedom is just not having any constraints, I don't think goes far enough in terms of what it means to be human. We are free for something. And that brings us into the next anthropological part, which has to do with the notion of choices or possibilities. Right? If we think of freedom in terms of choice, we tend to think of freedom as having a choice, right? Having options, usually options between two good things, right? That's where it really gets tricky. So this is the proverbial fork in the road, right? We come to the fork in the road. I got a nice picture of the road there, Jose. All right, we have two options. We have a choice, and since I'm driving the car, I can choose which way to go. So we tend to think right now, where I am looking at that road sign, that I am free because I have choices. And secondly, the other side of this is the notion that the one determining the choice to be made is me. And so I become the source of my activity. That's the notion of freedom as self determination. I determine which way we're going to go here. Now, again, I ask the question, is that enough to be fully human freedom? Right? In our roadway example, right, the focus is on having the choice, not making a choice. But simply having options from which to choose doesn't actually make me choose or doesn't actually lead to my choice. They're just options. And in effect, as being arbitrary options, in this case, I could go either way. There's really not much of a choice, especially if those two roads get me to the same place. So this is where we get the famous American philosophy, right? One of my favorite American philosophers, Yogi Berra, right, who famously said, if you come to a fork in the road, take it. Now, on the one hand, he's absolutely correct, because if you don't take one of those roads, you end up going nowhere. Right? So making a choice is significant, not just having the choice. But as we're going to see, making the choice that I make matters. If it doesn't matter which road I take, assume the only way that doesn't matter is if both roads get me in the same place. But if the roads go in different directions, then which choice I make matters. So freedom is not simply having the choice, it's making a choice. It's when I make the choice to drive right or left, I'm actually free to get somewhere. Otherwise, I'm just sitting still. Similarly, this idea of the choice being made by me, that's what freedom is, focuses freedom on the actor, on the person, that is on me. So as long as I make the choice doesn't matter. But again, to go back to our roadway example, right, and look at the person staring at the two options, then this notion of the self as absolute, right, suggests that the content of the choice makes no difference. But you and I both know, or at least I certainly know because I'm geographically challenged, that if I pick the wrong road and the wrong way to go, I'm going to end up terribly lost. I still made the choice. I determined which way to go, but I picked the wrong road. And so I don't get to where I want to get. So simply having a choice, simply my making the choice, again, is not enough. For a fully human freedom, right? Next slide. Again, if we posit the idea that our freedom is an ability or a freedom for something, what is it for? It's for seeking what is good. This is why we choose anything, because I think it's going to be good for me. If I didn't think it was going to be good for me, I wouldn't choose it. If I weren't concerned that it was good for me, I wouldn't have to make a choice at all. So we're looking, to go back to the fork in the road example, we're looking to get somewhere. And that also means that freedom is bound by truth. The truth of this road getting me to where I want to go, and this road on the right side, not the one on the left, or vice versa. Right? So there's a truth that's involved. And in this sense, what we choose matters significantly in our understanding of what freedom is. John Paul II, at the United Nations in 1995, as part of his speech, highlighted this distinctively human sense of freedom. It's one of the most often quoted thoughts of anything that this saint wrote. And while it's a little thick, let me work through it here. He says, detached from the truth about the human person. So if I take no regard for the truth, freedom deteriorates into license in the lives of individuals. License in the sense of pure permission to do whatever I want. I can pick either road, doesn't matter. In political life, he says, it becomes the caprice of the most powerful. The most powerful will choose whatever they want arbitrarily, and it becomes the arrogance of power. If freedom is disconnected from truth and goodness, in other words, power is the only thing that comes into play. If I don't choose wisely, then someone's going to choose for me. Right? If freedom is not a matter of truth and goodness, then someone else is going to end up choosing for me. And that's based purely on power. He continues, as a result of that thought, far from being a limitation upon freedom, which we tend to think it is, or a threat to it, which we tend to think it is, reference to truth, and especially the truth about a human person, is in fact the thing that guarantees freedom's future. Without the truth, he is saying, freedom is not going to exist. It's a pretty powerful statement in itself. It's a really powerful statement made at the United Nations.
Yeah. Yeah. So one of my favorite analogies, kind of tying in some of what you've said so far, which I think works really well with students, is you've mentioned the freedom for several times, right? And one of the analogies I've often heard and used myself is, I'm free to play the piano, and then I can walk up and bang on some keys, but I'm not. But I'm not going to make any music, and nobody's going to want to listen to that, right? Whereas the concert pianist who is trained is the one who's actually truly free to play the piano, because they can go up there and just go, right? Without, but in order for them to have gotten there, they spend a lot of time, quote unquote, being constrained by certain rules or things, practices to lead them to be able to just go. And so they're free for, in that case, rather than
Right. And I would say what the trained pianist came to learn was the truth of making music on a piano.
right.
Right? And there is a truth to it. You can make noise on a piano, but
Right.
to make music, you have to follow the truth of all those things that are involved in music. And to make really good music, you have to choose wisely. How to develop that gift. So that's the sense I think that John Paul is talking about
Yeah.
in terms of the truth of things.
Yeah. Beautiful. Yeah, love that quote. Thank you for sharing it. So
Sure. And that striving for truth and goodness is what leads into the third aspect of the anthropology of freedom, which has to do with responsibility. Again, if we go back to this idea of self-determination, right? We've said now that freedom in the sense of self-determination is more about making a choice than having a choice. Again, Yogi Berra was correct. When you come to a fork in the road, take it, because if you don't take it, you're not going anywhere. However, Yogi was incorrect in the sense that he didn't say that the choice matters. But we believe that making a choice has to do with what the end goal is, right? This notion of fulfillment, not just ability. It's not just my ability to make a choice. It's what am I trying to get to, or where am I trying to go in life? Right? Without knowing the truth then about where I want to go and how I'm going to get there, I'm going to be lost. And so, as we see and hear in John's gospel, Jesus, right, speaks about the truth setting us free. He being the truth. But how does the truth set us free? Well, when we know it, then we can make choices that are right, true, and good. In other words, we can make choices to get us where we want to go in life. That ability, that sense of self-determination is what we come to respect in other people, what we come to recognize as being part and parcel of being human in us is, by definition, also present in other people. And so we talk about recognizing and defending the freedom of others. Or, as St. Paul wrote in his letter to the Galatians, right, it is for this freedom, this distinctively human freedom, that Christ has set us free. Another way of looking at this in a spirituality kind of way, or a spiritual anthropology, St. Francis de Sales, whom I had to bring in here somewhere.
I was gonna say it wouldn't be it wouldn't be a commentary by you if Francis de Sales wasn't brought in at some point. I always love your pearls of wisdom that you bring in of his.
And the reason for that, everyone, is because I'm in the religious order called the Oblates of St. Francis de Sales. So he's our patron saint. Anyway, genius. He writes to a lady who is in her spiritual life trying to do all kinds of things to get holier. And he basically tells her, relax. Right? It's not about the multiplicity of things that we do. And he writes what has become one of his more famous quotes. He said, let us be what we are and be that well, in order to bring honor to the master craftsman whose handiwork we are. Then he repeats himself a little bit differently. He says, let us be what God wants us to be. Let us not be what we would like to be, contrary to his intention, even if what we want to be is good and holy and a saint. Let's be what God wants us to be. And he asks the rhetorical question at the end, even if we were the most perfect creatures under heaven, what good would that do if we were not as God's will would have us be? So in other words, our lives are not simply about me determining for me whatever I want. That's not going to get me to the happiness that I'm seeking. It's in this spiritual sense, the responsibility of being who I am called to be, being what God truly knows me to be, being the good person that God wants me to be. So it's that important emphasis on freedom being linked, bound really, to truth and goodness. Once I separate them, I get all kinds of different notions of freedom that lead into all kinds of difficulties. So yes, I am free. I'm free to be me. But the me that I am free to be, there's a truth to that. And finding that truth and following that truth, which is God's truth, is going to be critical to me fulfilling my freedom.
Right. So if we take all of this, and then we start to look at, the social and political views of freedom, it's no wonder a lot of the current cultural situation we live in is as is, because we're not applying that correct notion
Right.
of freedom
Right.
here, right? So it gets skewed in this context if we don't have it in the proper context. Before
Yeah,
you,
and again, it's not just the notion of freedom, it's really more basically the notion of what it means to be a person.
right,
That's going to be underlying all of the social political debates about freedom and the role of freedom in those debates, none of which I'm going to touch on tonight because this will take us a month.
right,
I know we only have an hour. So what I'd like to do is simply point out the contrasts in the grounding of those debates. Again, I think that the many political debates that we're in are all based on differing anthropologies, which is why I spend so much time on the anthropology of freedom. So let's see if we can look at some of those. The first has to do with, let's call it the person, the character of the person, or on the slide, I have the orientation of the person. And by that, I don't mean anything about gender, which is a continuing argument nowadays. But on the next slide, Jose, right? The notion of orientation in the sense of where am I going in life, right? The misconception is that that question, where I'm going in life, is value neutral. We think that society, it has to be a place where no one value, if you will, goal is favored over another. And there's a certain element of truth to that in the sense of valuing it. But where I want to go in life from the point of view of Christian anthropology is that I am leading, seeking what is good for me. It's not, I don't just sort of randomly do things in life, willy-nilly choose this, that, and whatever. I'm trying to accomplish something. I'm trying to reach happiness. So what it is I value matters. We cannot be completely, perfectly value neutral. A second kind of political debate has to do with human rights. Again, we respect rights, certainly the freedom as a right, but there's a misconception in society that rights are things that are conferred upon us. That is to say, that the government, in our democratic system, the majority confers rights upon us. The difficulty with that conception of freedom, we are free because the government has granted us freedom. The difficulty with that is if that's how rights work, then somewhere along the line, the government or whoever is doing the conferring can take those rights away, can undecide. And so in our Christian anthropology, we speak about freedom as the kind of right that is inherent to being human. Nobody gave it to us except God. It's sort of built into being human, and therefore no one can take it away from us. Now, in the United States of America, this is how our political system was founded. This idea of inalienable rights. You've heard that phraseology, right? That's the Declaration of Independence. And it's the first and foundational document, right, to our social political system. We are endowed with inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Right? It's not government giving them to us. It's government recognizing that we already have them. Which leads to, that foundation leads to the rule of law. Right? The Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and every positive law that is subsequently passed. But again, there's a divergence of viewpoints on what law is. The misconception, I think, is to see law as something protective. Right? It comes from the old saying that your freedom ends where my nose begins. That's the old way of looking at, a different way of looking at freedom. Or my freedom ends where your nose begins. I can't just walk up and punch you. I have the ability to. I can make the choice to. I could own my responsibility for it, but I'm not really free to just walk up and punch you in the nose. You get arrested. Law, in this misconception, is the protection of people from one another. Right? There's that from word again. Right? We are free in a system of law. We are free from harm or conflict. That's the goal of the law, which assumes about human people that they're going to be in conflict, which is a whole other philosophical question. The Christian anthropological notion of the rule of law is that it has a promotive function. Again, freedom for something, for our good, for what is true, for what is real. And that's a different conception of what the rule of law is. Right now, they're just some of the grounds of the debates without getting into all the specifics of the debates. But as you can guess, they come from the debates we have nowadays come from these differing ideas of what it means to be a person and therefore what it means to be free.
Right. I think what's good about, without getting into the issues, I think what's great to point out, what you're pointing out here is when you see these misconceptions, we can see that maybe the reason for so much conflict is the foundational principles where we're looking through a lens of makes it difficult to have productive debate on this. And so that's where we have to rein it in sometimes and go, oh, they're coming from this totally different perspective,
right,
and of the human person. And so maybe it's best to not engage right now on the issue, but let's go back to define some of these basic principles and ideas first.
Right, and we have to learn that. And the classic example of this is the pro-life debate. If you think about it, both sides of the debate are pro something, right? Pro-choice, pro-life. This is how the debates have, these are the terms in which the debates have been phrased, right? So pro-choice is a value-neutral position. It's the idea that the choice matters. And as we've said, it does matter. No one's going to be against choice. At the same time, right, the other side, if you will, the pro-life side is saying life matters. And again, just taking it at that face value, no one's going to deny that. So we're coming at the issue from very different conceptions of what it means to be a human being, right? What it means to be free as a human being. And that's why, we can't seem to resolve the debate because we're arguing from two very different perspectives. That's just the political look at it. The religious look obviously is somewhat different.
Yeah, so let's dive into the religious look a little bit.
Okay. And by this, again, I don't mean the political question of religious freedom, but in the broadest possible way, we're talking here about the freedom of a human being in relation to God. The problem that we run up against, the problem that religion runs up against, right, is this notion that religion is about commandments and rules. We just heard the commandments at Mass yesterday, and rules and behaviors and do's and don'ts. If I'm free, that sounds like God or the agent of God is imposing something on me, which sounds to us completely contrary to freedom. What the way to address this notion of freedom, though, is to look first, again, anthropologically, at what we believe about people. And one of those key things that we believe is this notion of original sin. What is that? We recognize that all of us as human beings prefer limited or immediate goods. Right? Think of the story of Adam and Eve. Why on earth in paradise did they eat that proverbial apple? Right? Why? Why would they pick that? Because knowledge, right? The knowledge, it came from the knowledge of the tree of good and evil. That's a really good thing. And it's something to be preferred. But is it to be preferred over life? Again, we humans tend to prefer limited goods. It's an immediate good. The apple's right there in front of me. I can see it. Right? It's right there. I can taste it. And so this is our human nature. We tend to want those good things immediately, even if they're not the best things. Right? Another way of looking at original sin is to say we are tempted to assert ourselves over and against God. Now, the beauty of it is that God gave us this freedom. Right? We can decide to go against God. That's a pretty gutsy move on God's part, allowing us the freedom to reject God. But as we're going to see, this is really critically important to being human, because ultimately our freedom in relation to God has to do with a gift. It is the gift of love. Why do we have all of those commands and rules? Because God loves. If he didn't care, he wouldn't have put in place all of those things. But they're meant to guide us to what is true and good and fulfilling about human life. And so freedom ultimately is a choice for others. It's the choice that Mary made. Right? I will be, let it be done to me according to your will. It's the choice that St. Joseph makes this year that we're celebrating St. Joseph. It's the choice, of course, that Jesus makes, who dies on the cross for others. Right? That's what we call love. That's a choice. That's the greatest use of our freedom, is to love. And ultimately, it's a choice for God. This is why, for instance, go back to the teachings of John Paul II, who are the highest exemplars of freedom? The martyrs, which at face value sounds like a contradiction. But they're choosing for the ultimate truth and goodness of God above everything, even their lives, that really sets them free.
I think this view of freedom, from the angle of that it is all about the law of gift and a choice for others, really just speaks and gets at the heart of the whole Christian life, and it connects everything, right? Because I know from a parental perspective, or even from being a teacher, ultimately, what is it that propelled me to do things was love for my students, it's love for my kids, it's love for my wife, and even the things you don't that don't feel good, or that you feel are quote unquote constraining your freedom, you look past those and you make the choice to move beyond the feelings out of that desire for the good of the other.
Right. Even just getting married, right? We think that's something that constrains us. Now I can't be in love with anybody else, but it's actually making the choice for someone that frees me to love.
Yeah.
So hopefully by now I've at least in some way addressed the misconceptions that we identified. Uh, the misconception that freedom means having no constraints. Actually, freedom is something for, not something from. Freedom is self-determination. Well, it is in a certain sense, but it's not in an absolutist sense, because I best determine my life, if you will, when I follow what is true and good. So freedom is bound, which is to say freedom is not free, not in the sense of there is no cost or responsibility involved. In fact, true human freedom makes us responsible for others. And lastly, freedom is not the ultimate value. Freedom ultimately is our choice to follow the greatest good and true and beautiful, which is God, who desires us to be united with him.
Excellent. Well, Father, this is a great summary. Really appreciate it. Do you have any thoughts on, specifically? I know you have some thoughts on how do we address these? How do we teach about this with our students?
My first response would be not easily, but we certainly can, and I think it varies depending on the grade level that you're teaching, and that really the reasoning level of your students. I mean, we can, starting with the very basics, just presenting them with scenarios. Am I free to fill in the blank? Am I free to get up and leave the classroom right now? Am I free to go to the bathroom whenever I want? Where are they free? What is their sense of freedom? Maybe a slightly older age. I used to have students choose between competing goods. What are some of their values in life? Their values are success and money. Okay, pick one. Which one is more important? Or their values are family and freedom. Okay, pick one. Right? Make them choose between, just to get them into that sensibility that freedom involves choices that are good. You can again sort of play a scenario in which a person is a jury, and this gets into more moral questions. When are we free to break the law? The classic example of the man speeding down the highway and speeding and running red lights so they can get his wife to the hospital who's giving birth. Would they convict the person of traffic violations? Sort of make them think that freedom is not simply following commandments. And then, again, depending on the ability of your students, can we even discuss things like life and liberty, the pursuit of happiness in this realm of inalienable rights? The key question in any of these, and any way that you can get students to do this, right? The question, Jose, right? On what basis do students decide things? Right? If we can get students to learn that their basis for making a decision, any kind of decision, that's the key to understanding freedom. Is it just any decision I want? Is it based on whatever I want? Is it based on passion? Is it based on truth and goodness? Any way we can get them to learn about decision making, I think, is the best way to teach about freedom.
Great. It's really good. It's really good insight, because I think kids, in a sense, you're getting them to think about their own thinking. Why am I doing this? Why am I not? And I think that's.
And they all want to make their own decisions. So,
right.
Okay, let them in theory, but then explain them.
Right. That's great. So this brings us to the next the portion of our episodes where I always ask about pop culture, and I like making cultural connections with the topics that we address. And so, Father, I know you have several, so I'd love for you to share some things that you think address this topic or the faith, and help us reflect and help our students reflect through some of these things.
Okay, but I'll be honest with you. When you asked me this question as we were preparing for this, I knew that whatever answer I would give would be a dead giveaway to my old age. especially the music question. I've stopped using music examples in classes because none of my students ever know what I'm talking about. In terms of music and freedom, I think that the classic responses are actually two responses or two songs that show the opposite, or that show the misconception of freedom. And of course, the classic is Frank Sinatra. No, I was not old enough to meet Frank, so let's not go there. But, his classic song, I Did It My Way. It's an anthem to self-determination in the absolutist sense that I can do things my way, whether they're good or not, whether they're true or not, whether it's helpful or not. As long as I do it my way, right, that's what matters. We know that not to be not true. The other, great song, Bruce Springsteen, still dating myself, but great song, Born to Run. But again, listen to the key lyric, right? Come with me, tramps like us, baby, we were born to run. Well, okay, we might be born to run, but we're born to run somewhere, right? Again, freedom is teleological. It has an end in mind. Without that end in mind, the choices I make could be disastrous. In terms of movies, you've already shown Braveheart, the choices we make against the forces of the reigning political powers. One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. I'm really dating myself here. These are old films, but again, that I always have a choice, and I need to make a choice that's true and good. They both emphasize that. In terms of books, there are a slew that have to do with freedom. Brave New World, freedom from drug-induced stupors. Animal Farm, 1984 would be another one. Political kinds of freedom, but really anything by Shakespeare, anything whatsoever. This is one of, if not the overarching theme of most of Shakespeare's corpus, is the idea of freedom and human freedom, and whether it results in tragedy or comedy or happiness or not. Freedom plays a huge role in all of Shakespeare's works.
I think with a topic like freedom, there's definitely a little bit more room as far as evaluating certain things in pop culture that you could easily more analyze from the perspective of, okay, how did the choices, what kind of choices did these characters make? What did that result in, etc. And so this is probably one of the easier ones to look to find connections in with pop culture. Sometimes, although these days a lot of the more modern stuff is showing people making bad decisions and
Right.
and no consequences
And championing that.
And
Someone I missed who it was. Andrew just mentioned A Man for All Season, another great example
Yeah.
of making good choices and the importance of making good choices.
Right. Well, excellent. We don't have too much time, but before I can kind of conclude, is there any questions? Heidi, do we have any questions in the chat box?
Hey, Jose, I do have 2 questions in the chat box as time allows.
Okay.
The first is, with the difficulty of Catholic school teachers today in telling the truth about the faith to their students, you see schools being sued because families don't like the truth that is being told to their children regarding issues like homosexuality, being disordered, or there being only 2 genders, etc. The truth means different things to different groups of people. Sometimes our schools don't want to touch on these topics. What can we do to catechize our children correctly according to the magisterium without being targeted as hateful, if that's possible?
Wow, great question. I'm only going to offer a short answer, which may be an incomplete one, but this goes back to the misconception that freedom is free, that it has no costs. It teaching the truth as we understand it and as we know it, presenting that truth in a culture where anything can be true is going to come with cost. There's no doubt about it. But I go back again. I always go back to Yogi, right? right? And the fork in the road. Which one of these ways that we're going to choose to think is going to get us to what we know to be true and good? What's going to get us to where we believe God intends us to be? I don't know how else to say it, but having the courage to choose truthfully and to present that truth is a painful choice sometimes. It requires courage, no doubt about it. But again, if we go back to the idea that only the truth will set us free, that's why we teach and preach what we do.
Excellent. I mean, to echo what you're saying is, we are entering a time in our culture. I mean, I don't know that there's ever been an easy time to be a Catholic school teacher, but at this point, like, this isn't for the weak. You know what I mean? Like, we've been entrusted with much, and it's going to be hard. It's going to get harder to ground things in the truth, but we have an obligation and a responsibility to do so. So, Heidi, other questions? The other question.
Yep, just one more. This one is, in my religious education class, my students attend public school. They receive so much conflicting information about freedom and truth that is skewed from what our Catholic faith teaches. How can we make connections for them that give them the ability to know when a contradictory teaching is said to them at school and how to combat it in charity?
Another great question. And I don't want to sound like a broken record, but it goes back to the truth issue. If we can get students to see that what is presented to them is not the truth, if we can get to them to see it's not true, then it's no longer a question of me or us or Catholicism imposing its faith. If we stick to can we figure out whether this is true or not? And does that matter? Which takes us back to the previous question. Again, if truth is, whatever we say it is in our culture, then why is anybody upset at any faith or no faith or whatever, right? In other words, the more I can help my students see through the issue, see beyond the issue to the truth at the end of it, I think that's going to help us convince them, because every student, believe it or not, is reasonable. We're all rational creatures, and I think the more we can focus on that and get away from the one side or another imposing some belief on me. Once students can see things for themselves and see the truth of things, they'll make the right choices. That's the nature of truth.
Thank you, Father. That was a great response. We really appreciate it. So, as we come to the end here, just a reminder. So next week, we will be back. Our topic next week will be Understanding the Paschal Mystery, featuring Dr. Matthew Ramage from Benedictine College. And the live session will take place on Tuesday, March 16th. If you need a certificate for having listened to or tuned into this episode or any previous episode, visit sophiainstituteforteachers.org/CITC certificates. That's sophiainstituteforteachers.org/CITC certificates. A reminder, certificates will only be issued the 1st and 15th of the month. If for free lessons on today's topic, as well as the other topics we've had, visit sophiainstituteforteachers.org/CITC lessons. That's sophiainstituteforteachers.org/CITC lessons. And please subscribe, give us a review, give us a rating on iTunes and YouTube and Vimeo and all the different places where you can listen. And be sure to visit our website for more resources, sophiainstituteforteachers.org. And thank you all for listening. Father Dailey, thanks for joining us. It was a pleasure having you. Great insights as always. And
Thank you, Jose, and thanks to all of the teachers who are following this. You're doing a critically important job, and I pray for you, and I hope you stick with it, and I hope you learn more, and I hope you give your students the truth and the goodness and the beauty of what we believe, because that's what will set them free.
Amen. Amen. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Father. God bless. Have a wonderful week, everybody, and hope to have you join us next week. Thank you for participating in this week's episode of Christ in the Classroom. In order to request a professional development certificate, please visit sophiainstituteforteachers.org/CITC certificates. In order to access the free lesson with today's theme, as well as show notes, please visit sophiainstituteforteachers.org/CITC lessons. Thank you and God bless you.